Music. What began as a casual remark developed within hours into an institutional earthquake with far-reaching consequences for the British royal family. A statement considered ill-advised internally unleashed a public firestorm that reignited old questions and brought previously suppressed doubts to the forefront. At the center of it all was Meghan Markle, whose comparison of her son Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor to Prince George not only sparked outrage but also set off a chain reaction that touched the very foundations of the monarchical order. The statement wasn't made in the palace, not in front of cameras, but away from the public eye. Yet its content found its way out and changed the situation. Within a very short time, the reaction shifted from irritated headshaking to serious scrutiny. Observers noted that the usual strategy of silence was absent. Instead of a retraction or downplaying, a quiet but consequential measure followed. The official account of the line of succession was revised. Names disappeared. Archie Harrison, Mountbatten, Windsor, and Lilibet. Diana Mountbatten and Windsor were no longer listed, without explanation, without announcement. This fact alone made it clear that this wasn't about hurt feelings, but about legal and institutional issues. The process was the visible expression of a conflict that had been simmering for years. The portrayal of Archie's birth, long defended as a private act, was always accompanied by inconsistencies. Unlike previous royal births, there was a lack of public confirmation, accompanying medical information, and ritualized procedures. While clear protocols were followed for Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, much remained vague in Archie's case. These deviations were initially explained by a desire for privacy. But the longer the gaps persisted, the stronger the suspicion grew that there was more to it. Added to this was the absence of key religious and institutional rituals. A formal christening according to traditional patterns did not take place, at least not in a publicly verifiable way. Instead, a single picture circulated without context, without official accompaniment, without the usual transparency. For many, this was a detail. For others, a signal. In a system built on continuity and traceability, every deviation raises questions, and these questions didn't disappear. They accumulated. The turning point came when internal documents began circulating, suggesting a different chronology. There were references to medical procedures outside the United Kingdom, dates that didn't align with the official version, and references to legal constructs unusual in monarchical contexts. Suddenly, it wasn't just the form that was up for debate, but the core issue, the legal definition of descent and birth in terms of succession to the throne. Simultaneously, another aspect came into focus. Financial connections. Funds officially earmarked for renovations resurfaced in a different context. The trail led through corporate structures and payments whose purpose was unclear. What initially appeared to be administrative ambiguity took on the form of a systematic approach with each new detail. The question of whether public funds had been misappropriated robbed the matter of its political dimension. Music. Within the palace, the perception grew that a boundary had been crossed, not only in a personal but also in an institutional sense. Previous agreements based on mutual silence began to crumble. Public criticism of the monarchy, expressed in interviews, television series, and publications, was interpreted as a breach of those tacit agreements that had once allowed for an orderly retreat. With each new accusation, the pressure to remain passive intensified. The comparison between Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor and Prince George acted as a catalyst in this context. It brought to the forefront what had long been discussed behind closed doors, the question of legitimacy, of equality, and of boundaries. For some, it was a provocation. For others, an exposure. In any case, it made it clear that the conflict could no longer be contained. At the end of this first chapter, a decision was reached that spoke volumes without words. The adjustment of official documents, the silence instead of justification, the absence of explanations. All of this pointed to a strategy that prioritized legal clarity over public debate. Was this the beginning of a definitive separation between personal narrative and institutional truth, or merely a call for even greater escalation that would fundamentally alter the monarchy's self-image? With the disappearance of the names from the official presentation of the line of succession, a period of intensive reconstruction of past events began. Observers, legal experts, and institutional auditors turned their attention back to 2019, to the weeks surrounding the birth of Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor, which were already marked by unusual silence. The more precisely the events were reconstructed, the more apparent the discrepancies became between public narrative and internal procedures. What had long been considered a modern approach to privacy now appeared to be a carefully orchestrated evasion of established protocols. The absence of customary confirmation was particularly striking. Previous births within the inner circle of the line of succession had been governed by clear procedures, medical witnesses, timely announcements, and coordinated public appearances. In the case of Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor, however, these elements remained fragmentary. Official accounts of the place and time of his birth changed repeatedly, were evasive, and the otherwise routine presence of medical institutions in the public discourse was completely absent. These gaps initially went largely unnoticed, but in retrospect, they gained significance. Furthermore, a temporal ambiguity raised questions about the actual sequence of events. Internal documents that later came to light indicated medical procedures that did not align with the officially communicated birth date. These indications could no longer be dismissed as mere rumors, as they originated from administrative and logistical contexts that are usually meticulously documented. The discrepancy between these records and the public narrative reinforced the impression that crucial information had been deliberately withheld. The question of the birthplace attracted particular attention. While the official account stated a birth in the United Kingdom, other documents pointed to events occurring outside the country. In a system whose legal foundations are tied to clear geographical and biological criteria, this point music was of central importance. The discussion quickly shifted from moral judgments to legal definitions. It was no longer a matter of sympathy or antipathy, but of the interpretation of applicable law. At the same time, interest grew in the missing religious and institutional acts. The absence of a publicly verifiable baptism according to an established pattern was not a mere detail, but another piece of the puzzle. In the history of the monarchy, such rituals had taken place even in times of crisis because they symbolized continuity. The fact that this was not the case here reinforced music. The impression of a deliberate distancing. The explanation that they wanted to give the child a normal childhood seemed increasingly inadequate against this backdrop. The more questions were asked, the more the role of the institutions involved came into focus. Why had the responsible authorities tolerated deviations? Why had there been no earlier clarification? The answer apparently lay in tacit agreements aimed at avoiding conflict. As long as public calm was maintained, there was no immediate pressure to act. But this strategy came at a price. The pent-up doubts now erupted with all the more force. The growing discrepancy between public narrative and internal documentation could no longer be ignored. Legal experts pointed out that the relevant regulations leave little room for interpretation. Terms such as lineage, birth, and legitimacy are precisely defined therein. Any deviation from these definitions has immediate consequences for titles, precedents, and rights. Viewed in this light, previous decisions not to delve into the matter publicly appeared as a postponement, not a solution. At the end of this section music came the realization that the doubts had not arisen from a thirst for sensationalism, but from structural inconsistencies. The questions of birth and legitimacy had developed a momentum of their own that could no longer be controlled. Was the long silence an attempt to buy time, or an expression of the hope that the matter would resolve itself? And what further details would come to light if the examination of the past music were pursued rigorously? As the investigation expanded, the focus shifted from temporal and biological questions to financial matters. What initially appeared to be a peripheral issue quickly became one of the most explosive elements of the entire affair. Internal accounting, budget entries, and payment flows moved into the spotlight because they suggested a connection between public funds and private transactions. The question was no longer simply how Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor was born, but also who had borne which costs and on what legal basis. The starting point for the investigations was expenditure related to the renovation of Frogmore Cottage. Officially, these were measures to adapt a historic property to modern safety and living standards. The sums were substantial but explainable. However, upon closer examination of the documents, auditors discovered payment orders whose purpose was described as scales. The descriptions were vague. Proof of expenditure remained general, and the recipient structures appeared unusual. These ambiguities aroused suspicion. The diversion of funds through an intermediary corporate structure was particularly conspicuous. The existence of Art Genesis LLC, which surfaced in the payment records, raised new questions. Why was a company outside the United Kingdom involved for alleged renovations or consulting services? And why were several transfers made in close temporal proximity to the medical events that had already raised suspicions? The temporal correlation could no longer be dismissed as mere coincidence. With each new piece of information, the suspicion that public funds might have been misappropriated gained traction. The sums involved were not marginal, but rather of a magnitude that demanded parliamentary attention. In a system based on transparency and accountability, this represents a significant burden. The possibility that funds from the sovereign grant had been channeled into private arrangements added a new dimension to the matter. It transformed a family controversy into a matter of public interest. At the same time, the unspoken agreements surrounding Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's withdrawal from active royal duties were once again brought into sharp focus. The so-called Sandringham Agreement, long portrayed as a pragmatic compromise, took on a different meaning in light of new revelations. Passages that suggested mutual silence and a renunciation of questions were reinterpreted. They now appeared less like a fair settlement and more like a mechanism for avoiding deeper scrutiny. This tacit agreement apparently held as long as both sides respected it. But with the continued public criticism of the monarchy, the accusations of structural injustice, and the media attention, it lost its foundation. Every new publication increased the pressure on the institution to clarify its own position. The accusation of misappropriating public funds could not be refuted by silence. The financial trail therefore acted as a catalyst, linking biological questions with legal and political consequences. Legal experts emphasized that even the suspicion of misappropriation was sufficient to initiate formal investigations. The aim was less about assigning criminal guilt than about restoring institutional credibility. In this context, it became clear that the monarchy had to defend not only its tradition but also its fiscal integrity. At the end of this section, a sobering realization emerged. The affair had long since transcended the private sphere. It touched upon fundamental questions of responsibility, transparency, and trust. The interplay of money flows, tacit agreements, and unresolved birth circumstances painted a picture that demanded consequences. Music. Was the Sandringham Agreement a fragile truce from the outset, and could an institution dependent on continuity afford to leave these questions unanswered? With the collapse of the tacit agreements, the phase of open escalation began. What had previously been negotiated behind closed doors increasingly shifted into the public sphere. Interviews, television series, and publications' music contributed to painting an image of the monarchy characterized by coldness, exclusion, and structural injustice. For the institution, this meant a loss of trust that could no longer be ignored. Each new revelation felt like another blow to the agreement that had once allowed Meghan Markle and Prince Harry to step back from their royal duties. The constant media attention reinforced the impression of a deliberate course of confrontation. Instead of distancing themselves from the monarchy and emphasizing their own independence, the monarchy's structures were repeatedly thrust into the spotlight. This created a paradoxical picture. On the one hand, the institution was criticized and morally questioned. On the other hand, it remained the central point of reference, the focus of public attention. This contradiction undermined the credibility of the narrative and intensified the perception within the palace of a breach of contract. With each new accusation, the question of consequences gained in urgency. The previously practiced restraint was increasingly interpreted as weakness. Internal voices warned that continued silence could be seen as an admission of guilt. At the same time, there was growing concern that an open confrontation would further escalate the situation. In this tension between restraint and the need for action, the realization matured that a clear, legally sound approach was necessary. The break was finally addressed publicly as internal clauses that explicitly aimed at mutual silence. These passages, once considered a guarantee for an orderly transition, lost their effectiveness as soon as they were no longer respected. The publication of personal accounts and accusations made it clear that the basis of the compromise no longer existed. The institution was thus left with only one option: to redefine its position. At the same time, public pressure intensified. Media outlets and observers increasingly questioned why certain topics had been excluded for years. The debate about transparency became more heated. In an environment characterized by mistrust, the mere appearance of a lack of transparency is enough to sow doubt. The monarchy found itself compelled to defend not only its traditions but also its decision-making processes. During this phase, other members of the royal family also came under scrutiny, though less through their own actions than through their reticence. While public appearances remained sober and controlled, the contrast with the emotionally charged portrayals outside the institution intensified. This juxtaposition shaped public perception. On the one hand, the continuity and discipline of the monarchy. On the other, the persistent criticism and self-promotion. Music. For many observers, this was a turning point, a redistribution of sympathies. The break with the monarchy was thus less evident in a single event than in a series of decisions. Every publication, every renewed criticism contributed to widening the distance and diminishing the willingness to be lenient. The question was no longer whether there would be a reaction but how. Within the institution, the conviction grew that only a formal, legally secured step could end the resulting ambiguity. Music. At the end of this phase, an atmosphere of inevitability prevailed. The escalation had reached a point where a return seemed impossible. Was the public criticism an attempt to gain moral authority or to exert pressure through a middle ground? And what form would the monarchy's reaction take if it decided to no longer simply stand by and watch? The monarchy's reaction was not a public appearance, but a sober, legally precise measure. While outside observers were still speculating about motives and possible scenarios, work was underway behind the scenes on a solution that left no room for interpretation. The focus was on a structural clarification that would stand the test of time, independent of emotions and media pressure. The decision aimed to permanently eliminate ambiguities and secure the institutional foundations. At its core was the adjustment of the relevant rules that define who can hold titles and be part of the line of succession. These rules, historically developed and amended several times, were now being reviewed once again. This was less about individual cases than about principles. The institution had to ensure that its criteria were clearly verifiable and legally sound. In this context, the precise definition of lineage and birth became crucial. The implementation took the form of a formal amendment that was quiet but effective. Instead of explicitly excluding individuals, the framework was precisely defined, clearly specifying certain prerequisites. This approach avoided personal attacks and emphasized the institutional nature of the decision. The consequences arose automatically from the application of the new regulation. This prevented the impression that it was a retaliatory measure. Simultaneously, the financial dimension was further investigated. The review of payment flows and documentation of expenditures led to formal claims for reimbursement. These steps underscored that this was not merely a matter of symbolic importance, but also one of safeguarding the public interest. The institution signaled its willingness to hold accountable without engaging in public disputes. The message was clear. Rule violations have consequences regardless of personal prominence. Public perception of these measures was divided. Critics saw them as a cold show of force, while supporters viewed them as a necessary clarification. Regardless of the assessment, it was undeniable that the monarchy had chosen a path aimed at longevity. The legal anchoring of the decision prevented it from being challenged again later. This removed a finality that had been lacking in earlier phases. Simultaneously, the tone of the public debate changed. While emotional narratives had previously dominated, legal arguments now took center stage. The discussion shifted from individual motives to structural issues. This shift relieved pressure on the institution, as it removed the conflict from the realm of personal disputes. The clarity of the measure reduced the scope for speculation, even though it raised new questions. Within the royal family, the decision was understood as a necessary step toward stabilization. Years of uncertainty had eroded trust in the institutional order. The formal clarification brought an end to a state of ambivalence. The focus on legal foundations was intended to prevent similar conflicts from escalating again in the future. At the end of this phase, an image of controlled resolve emerged. The monarchy had not reacted loudly, but structurally. The measures were designed to be lasting and to channel further debate. But the question remained how this decision would be perceived in the long term. Would it be seen as a necessary safeguard of order, or as a symbol of a growing distance between the institution and the public? And what impact would this clarification have on the future relationship between personal narrative and monarchical reality? With the formal clarification, the institutional process was complete, but the societal debate was only just beginning. The decision seemed to bring an end to years of uncertainty, but also to act as a mirror reflecting differing expectations of the monarchy. For some observers, it confirmed the impression of an institution that defends its rules uncompromisingly. For others, it revealed a gap between modern self-perception and traditional foundations. Regardless of the assessment, one thing was clear: the events had fundamentally altered the image of the monarchy. At the center of these repercussions were Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, whose public presence noticeably lost momentum. The once dominant narrative of exclusion and moral superiority clashed with a stark legal reality that left little room for emotional interpretation. The discussion shifted away from personal motives and toward structural issues that could no longer be influenced solely by public sympathy. This also changed the tone of the reporting, which became increasingly detached and analytical regarding Archie Harrison, Mountbatten Windsor, and Lilibeth Diana. For Mountbatten Windsor, this development represented a clear, albeit harsh, demarcation. Their role in public discourse transformed from potential bridges between two worlds to symbolic figures in an unresolved conflict. The institution's decision eliminated further speculation but simultaneously made it clear that personal narratives are insufficient to establish institutional affiliation. This realization shaped the final phase of the debate. Within the royal family, the situation was perceived as having stabilized. The years of uncertainty had tied up resources and strained trust in established procedures. With the formal clarification, a state of affairs based on unambiguous rules was restored. This return to clarity was considered a prerequisite for refocusing on representative duties and long-term planning. The decision was understood less as a victory and more as a necessary correction. At the same time, it became clear that the monarchy was sending a signal beyond the specific case with this measure. It made clear that personal narratives, media presence, and moral appeals reach their limits where legal foundations begin. In an era where public perception is often used as an instrument of power, this represented a conscious counterposition. The institution defined itself not through approval, but through continuity and adherence to rules. The repercussions of this decision, however, extended beyond the royal family. The public debate about the role of traditions in a modern society was reignited. The event served as an example of the conflict between individual self-realization and institutional order. It became evident that while the monarchy can withstand criticism, its fundamental principles are non-negotiable. This stance was interpreted by some as strength, by others as stubbornness. In the end, an ambivalent picture remained. The monarchy had defended its order, but also created a distance that will not be without consequences. The personal story of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry lost its appeal, while the institutional perspective gained weight. The central question now was how this rebalancing would play out in the long term. Would the clarity of the rules strengthen trust or give rise to new forms of criticism? And is this decision a final conclusion or merely another stage in a conflict that will continue to affect the monarchy for a long time to come?